Chapter 14. Neither worldly nor well. If the extent of the Great Britain covenants with Canada had been known, the mother country would have been exposed to scandal and disgrace. Having gone so far and risked so much, was it plausible that the British would, in the final stage, leave the decision in the hands of Newfoundlanders, when previously they had done everything in their power to decide the matter for them? They established a controversial and troublesome national convention rather than return the Newfoundland Parliament. It is risky they would risk returning it in a referendum. Conspirators do not conspire to fail. It was the British who held a referendum in Newfoundland in 1948. They decided what options would appear on the ballot paper, and it was they who counted the votes. Governor MacDonald and the British exercised the tightest control over the process. In 1933, Alexander Clutterbuck wrote in the Royal Commission report that for the Newfoundland, considerations of constitutional status were regarded more of a matter of academic decision than as a practical issue. That thinking was essentially unchanged in 1948, whether Britain did fix the vote or not. They had put themselves in every position to do so, and it would be unrealistic to think they were not prepared to follow through. There is no official record, even in the top secret files, of any such plan, but that is not surprising. Nevertheless, over 6 years later, the belief in such a plan is active in Newfoundland and elsewhere. It is supported by personal accounts of those involved and in personal papers such as those of Charles R. Granger. Charlie Granger was the executive assistant to Jack Pickersgill after Confederation. When Pickersgill ran for elected office and became Newfoundland's representative in the federal cabinet of Lester Pearson, Granger himself later became a minister in the Trudeau government. For a time, he was also a member of the Newfoundland provincial government. Throughout his many years in public life, he interviewed people at both the federal and provincial levels about the Newfoundland referendum on Confederation. In all these interviews, he found that they commonly did not want to talk about the vote. They found it a painful memory and overall described it as a bad business. In the end, Granger became to believe that the vote had been tampered with. Nehemiah Short was the chief electoral officer for the referendum and was stationed at the House of Assembly. He and the British officials with him received the returns there by telephone, and as they were tallied, a uniformed member of the Newfoundland Constabulary took them across the road to the governor and his officials at Government House. Sir Gordon MacDonald had sole responsibility for compiling and publishing the results. There was no direct communication between the returning officer's office and the governor. According to Granger, it was that secrecy that made the vote tampering possible. As Jim Haley explained, the British operated on a need-to-know basis. There would be no written records, and only those who absolutely had to know about the plans to change the election results were told. Joy Smallwood, for instance, was not told. It would have demoralized him. He would have accepted it, but there was more to be gained from his performance by not telling him. The only Newfoundlander who would need to know was Nehemiah Short, the returning officer. 2 days after the vote, and long before the results could be confirmed, Governor MacDonald wrote to Sir Eric Machin at the Commonwealth Relations Office about the successful outcome obtained in the referendum. It would have taken at least a month for a full recount of the close results, but within 8 days, in spite of a call for a recount on the West Coast, both Great Britain and Canada accepted the results as conclusive. Within 2 weeks of the vote, a number of ballots were burnt in St. John's. David Butler was a powerful bureaucrat in the Smallwood government after Confederation, but during the summer of 1948 he was an assistant to Commissioner Herman Quinton. Shortly after the vote, Butler was ordered by Quinton to take a truckload of ballots to the General Hospital in St. John's and burned them in the furnace there. When Butler arrived at the hospital, he decided to open the burlap sacks before he destroyed them. The sacks were filled with ballots, and even the ballot boxes from the second referendum. Butler was troubled by his orders from Quinton, so he telephoned the Chief Electoral Office, Nehemiah Short, whom he knew, and told him what Quinton had ordered. Short replied, "The ballots were counted, neither worthily nor well. Burn them." Butler burnt the ballots, but kept one of the boxes for a souvenir. Later on, when Short's secretary was questioned about the ballot count after his death, she became extremely upset, burst into tears, and would only say, "You better let sleeping dogs lie." All these accounts, through unofficial, corroborate each other and are consistent with the official record of deception. The usual placement of the returning office at the House of Assembly is in isolation from the governor, who received and announced the final results, ensured ample opportunity to tamper with the results. The haste in burning the historic ballots prevented any possibility of a recount. Why were the ballots not preserved for a conclusive recount? And to show off the fine achievement, as Whitehawk called it. In addition, there is no record of any poll-by-poll compilation of results from a second referendum. All of these points add credence to the argument the British conspired to control the results of the second referendum and put Newfoundland into Confederation regardless of the wishes of the people of Newfoundland. There is also the haunting testimony of Dr. Harold Paddock, a linguist, professor emeritus at Memorial University of Newfoundland from 1972 to 2002. In 1967, when Paddock was a graduate student at the University of London, he became friends with Margaret Davis, a journalist who had a popular BBC weekly radio show, Calling Newfoundland, which was broadcasted in Newfoundland from 1941 until just before her death in 1972. The daughter of D.S. Davis, Newfoundland's Trade Commissioner in the United Kingdom, Margaret Davis loved Newfoundland and devoted her life to helping Newfoundlanders in London. During the 3 years he was there, Paddock was a guest on several of Davis's shows, and in February 1967, he was at Bush House, the home of BBC Overseas Services, waiting to record one of his poems. Seated next to him was an older English gentleman, a friend of Davis. He told Paddock in conversation that he had been in Newfoundland for several years working with the Commission of Government, and that he had married an unreal Newfoundlander, meaning a townie. But the young graduate student knew very little about those years. The Englishman asked about the small outport of Beaumont in Green Bay, where Paddock came from, and about the poem he was going to record for Davis. Keep up the Fince, Fince, as Paddock recounted. The man was quiet for a while after reading the poem and obviously very moved. He then told me that he had something he wanted to tell me, that he had a confession to make. He did not have long left to live, and he wanted to tell someone from Newfoundland, a real Newfoundlander, meaning a Baysman. He said to me, "Your poem is about how badly the Newfoundlanders treated the native, I can't pronounce this, Beothuk Indians. But what you don't know is how badly the British treated you. You became the new natives, even though you were white." In 1948, while working for the Commission government, In 1948, while working for the Commission government, he was recalled to Whitehall. We were told that there would be a referendum, and the results that we would have to announce would be Confederation with Canada. And if there was another result, we would have to change it to Confederation. This, of course, was very unusual, and we questioned it, and we were told that the reason for this was that it had already been agreed to by Churchill and Roosevelt during the war in Newfoundland. During the war, that Newfoundland must never again be allowed to go unprotected as an ideal advance base for any attack from across the Atlantic. Churchill, wanting to keep Newfoundland in the Commonwealth, brought in Mackenzie King, who staked his claim, to which both Churchill and Roosevelt agreed. After this directive, he returned to St. John's. The two referenda were held and on the second ballot on July 22nd. The results were virtually the same. On the first one, Confederation did not win. Responsible government won by approximately 51 to 49 for Confederation. Those, he said, were the percentages rounded off to the nearest figure. It was a very slight majority for responsible government. We were all very relieved because we didn't know what we would do if we'd had to make a big change. If it had been 55 to 45 or worse, that would have been hard, but the population was virtually split down the middle. We only had a nudge in the other way. I believe at the time that Britain was doing it for the best, but I regret it now, he said. Paddock recalled that at just this moment he was called in to record his poem. He was in such a state of shock that he could barely get through in reading it. I realized that I didn't have Sorry, let me start. I realized that I didn't even know the man's name, but when I got out of the studio, both he and Margaret had gone. Paddock was so disturbed by what the Englishmen had told him that he couldn't work for weeks. Confederation was 17 years old in Newfoundland then, and after much thought he decided not to tell anyone about what he'd heard. I am sorry now, he said, that I didn't telephone Margaret Davis for the gentleman's name and then get him to put his confession in writing and sign it. Paddock finally shared his story with journalist Ray Guy in 1974, and later with Bern Walsh and Gwen Dreyer. He has since learned a great deal about the period of Newfoundland's history. Paddock's story should surprise no one. It has all the details of truth and in all aspects conforms to the history of the period as we now understand it. The secret agreement reached early in the war between Roosevelt and Churchill and Mackenzie King is now generally known, but the full implications are rarely drawn. There was no way to predict which way Newfoundland would vote in the referendum, and both Great Britain and Canada thought it unlikely that Newfoundland would choose Confederation without a push. So, although responsible government might appear on the ballot, it would not be permitted to win. If somehow Britain bungled the referendum process and Newfoundland achieved independence, the island would be up for grabs by the Americans. But Britain was not about to see Newfoundland and Labrador, that great bargaining counter, slip out of their hands. Nothing was left to chance. Shortly after the results of the second referendum were announced, Sir Alan Herbert wrote to the Times of London, "I have felt from my first days in this affair that Whitehall, there is no party question here, was set upon Confederation and steadily working for it all the time. I am now sure of it." Thomas Lodge was moved to write in a letter to the Guardian newspaper that Confederation had been achieved by an unholy deal. Lodge, not surprisingly, received neither a silver salver nor a knighthood for his work. When the British government set up the National Convention in St. John's, it sent out Sir Kenneth Ware as a constitutional expert to the convention. Later, when Ware was rectored for Exeter College, I'll spell that out, Exeter College, Oxford, he frequently expressed his disapproval of the process employed in Newfoundland. Harry Winter, the Newfoundland Commissioner for Justice and Defense from 1945 to 1947, wrote that the setting up of the National Convention was both a breach of contract as regards to the Act and letter patents and breach of faith with the Algerines government. Indeed, Prime Minister Frederick Algerines and all those who accepted the commission in 1933 would have considered the National Convention and the referenda adopted by the Dominion's office in 1948 an unimaginable violation of both the letters and the spirit of the engagement of 1933. From London to St. John's, there were many who cried foul about Newfoundland's entry into Confederation, but none of them could hold raw power to account. However, the very nasty taste of one British MP put it has never gone away. And that's the end of chapter 14. Thank you.